Hi, my name is Alan Allison. I'm a Southern California resident, so if I say dude or something along those lines, that's why. Born and raised in Southern California, earned my bachelor's degree from the University of California, Irvine. For over the last 20 years or so, I've worked a lot with military, finance, healthcare, and different organizations to help build security infrastructures and compliance. I'm currently at Navisite. We are a managed service provider where we deal with customers from all walks of life, everything from small, medium business to very large government entities. At Navisite, I hold the role of Chief Security Officer.
So Michael Daly from Raytheon.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Michael Daly from Raytheon, and I am the Corporate Director of IT Security for Raytheon, responsible for the policy for what we call core infrastructure, internet access, hosting services, for the desktop security controls, for intelligence, counterintelligence, incident handling, and operations. Raytheon, I think most of you probably know, we're the Tomahawk cruise missile people and Patriot, and we make a lot of different sensors and other military equipment. And so for us, cybersecurity is extremely important.
Okay, Kurt Hackinson from Northrop Grumman.
I'm Kurt Hackinson from Northrop Grumman. I'm currently a chief technologist. I support the CIO for our electronic systems sector. I'm a former cybersecurity guy. I don't know if you can ever really be a former security person, but I still maintain pretty close contact with the folks over there. Certainly worked with Raytheon Corporation, working for Northrop Grumman. We are in the same business in addition to cybersecurity, so glad to be here.
And David Saul from State Street Corps.
Good afternoon. My name is David Saul. I am at State Street. I am chief scientist. And before you ask the question, why does a financial services company need a chief scientist, and also why am I on the cybersecurity panel? Prior to my current job, I served for 5 years as our chief information security officer, and before that, I was chief architect within our IT organization. The chief scientist role at State Street encompasses security as well. My job is to act as a catalyst for innovation, and we see security, privacy, and those related areas as being just as ripe for innovation as any other part of our business.
So there's some commonality within the set of panels here. We all have to deal with supply chains and defending these supply chains. And when you compare the defense industrial base with financial services, we're all in the same boat. So in the past panels, we heard talks on risk and uncertainty. We heard distributed defense come up a little bit, and being able to measure risk in some way. So let me provide a basis for our discussions. Our business operations extend globally across contested supply chains. These operations are under a constant siege of threat agents that employ breach activities that are distributed, decentralized, multi-scale, and operate over multiple time periods. The shift from the monoculture that binds us into reactive defense posturing, we are trending towards security as a platform, a way of collaborating and sharing information between organizations that have value chains within these supply chains. So part of our discussions are going to be, how do we share that information? How do we meaningfully share not raw data, but actionable information? So let me start out with the first question here. So today's companies and other public organizations are increasingly involved in supply chains across both inter-organizational socio-political boundaries. These supply chains can be found to be contested well after the initial attack was issued. So what types of policies and operations and technology can help limit risk exposure, enable sense making, and allow the value chains to work through these environments? So anybody want to start out with that? David?
I'll start. At State Street, we view cybersecurity and the threats within a larger context of risk management. For those people who are not familiar with State Street, we're in financial services. Our customers are institutional investors around the world. Some of the largest and most complex financial institutions. So we need to take a holistic view of all aspects of risk, and not to diminish the threat in any way, but it's really just one part of operational risk. I don't think I need to tell anyone about the disruption that's happened in financial markets around the world over the past 3 years. So we need to look at all aspects of that, capital risk, transactional risk, and but within that, taking a very similar risk-based approach, which also helps us to decide where we want to make our investments vis-a-vis the risks that we're dealing with. So coming back to my original point, I believe that there is some science to this. It's not just hit or miss, and that taking a structured approach to risk management and cybersecurity within that for companies, whatever business they're in, is the right way to manage it.
Yeah, at Raytheon, we've established some policies for our supply chain around cyber. It's essentially a checklist that says, how we want to handle authentication and how we want to handle encryption and so on. So we've got this, grand checklist, and it, is embedded in our various contract boilerplates. But as you indicated, David, we also have to deal with the real world, and risk management is how you do that. And so, for instance, if we're looking at outsourcing, 401k management, let's say, and some PII might be sent over to them, all of the folks responding to that RFP may or may not be encrypting their back end. And our policy says, well, of course you have to encrypt it. But it may be that we still want to go with a company that doesn't encrypt the back end, and we'll put other mitigating factors in place. So we have policy, but risk management is there to help temper the binary decisions.
And in our organization, we have the benefit of working in multiple different types of industries. So we talk to people in the finance industry. We've got several customers that are 3-letter government agencies. They span multiple different walks of life, and everybody's kind of going through the same types of evolution right now. Everybody is able to gather security data, and they're able to share it one way, but the problem that we still have is collaboration. So in our industry, we're working through methods of providing that correlation of the multiple types of information, finding a way to normalize it and have actionable, usable, real data that we can work with the FBI or DHS. We can provide updates to customers that they might not otherwise get, and it's becoming a very evolutionary way to respond to common threats that are hitting all walks of life.
One of the challenges that we're seeing is there is that's just a statistical problem, is that most of the suppliers that are out there are not multi-billion-dollar corporations. They're small, medium-sized businesses. And the stark reality of working with and getting to know small and medium-sized businesses is they don't have the resources, the wherewithal, or the security regimes in place in many cases. It's not their core business. They're in the business of manufacturing something or providing services. So I think one of the big challenges that we're looking at, and I think that all industries are looking at, is how do we address putting in cybersecurity in places that didn't probably even think that it applied to them, that it wasn't a problem for them until perhaps their buyers started looking at that. So I think there's a process of balancing influence as the buyer of these services, along with the willingness and cooperation and being able to give up some of your own resources in order to be able to help them do that. And checklist is a great start. We have one too, same basic idea, but when you go and levy a checklist on a company of 100 people who Uncle Carl comes in on Thursday afternoon to do the IT for them, and there is no full-time security person to interview about their firewalls, it becomes a little bit tricky with that checklist.
So, David, you brought up a holistic view, kind of creating a healthy cyber ecosystem, and not only looking at hardware possibly, and just to talk at it a bit, but look at software and people, where awareness is an important aspect. So I read the 2011 Verizon breach report, and they talked about compromises happening minutes, the realization of those compromises taking days to weeks to months sometimes, and then to mitigate those issues take up to weeks. What can companies do when we're faced with these threat agents that are operating over these multiple time periods, using multiple attack vectors? Sometimes they're very simple threat vectors, using PDFs embedded in email. And these attacks occur over months, not just days, where you might see the email transform into lateral movement and things. What can companies do to create a healthy ecosystem combining various strategies, not focusing on these silver bullet technologies, but stepping back and looking at the overall problem?
Jumping right in. So we've got a set of guidelines that we're using to deal with that issue and trying to promote it across our supply chain as well. So the first is, of course, employee awareness. Things are going to get past all of those commercial tools and even some of your custom tools. Your employees are your defense against the most clever attacks. And so that is the first cornerstone for us. The second is a focus on what we call command and control blocking, C2 blocking. And that's looking at outbound traffic. So most of us have spent a lot of time putting in firewalls, blocking the inbound attacks, or hardening systems, which of course you have to do all those things. But it's also important to look at the outbound traffic, because there are going to be vulnerabilities on your system that are 0 days, they're unpatched, there's nothing you're going to be able to do about it. So then you ask yourself, well, if I'm going to get infected, what can I do next? Okay, watch for the traffic that is leaving your network. And so that's another really key point. And then the third one I'll mention is about data segregation or system segregation. Putting those firewalls back in place that maybe years ago you ripped out in order to form a one company initiative, right? So you need to put those back in place and say, well, if Bob and Mary are in finance, maybe they don't need access to the HR system. And if Sue is in HR, maybe she doesn't need access to the finance system and so on. So you need to put those walls back up.
Just to add on that, there's a term that's been used in cybersecurity for a while. We didn't invent it, called defense in depth. And what it says is that you need to have all of the things that are there. I'm a technology person. I spent my whole career in technology, but this is not something that technology is going to solve alone. You do need to have firewalls. You do need to have data leakage protection. We're just as concerned, if not more so, about data going out, because we're the custodian of that data for our customers, and that's what our business is all about, intellectual property. I mean, there are a lot of things that we need to look at. We have a combination of technologies. Here's an area where innovation, all of the innovations in security technology are not going to come necessarily from the large companies. This is where a small company, MIT derivative, might come up with something that's very useful. So we're constantly adding those. We're changing them, because part of the any attack starts with probing to try and determine what you look like, and if you change that, it's going to make it more difficult. But I couldn't agree more about awareness. We have a program of employee awareness. Every employee every year has to go through an education program. They get tested on it. We also have had a program for a number of years where we teach our developers how to write secure code. And again, that's not a substitute for testing and everything else. The third area, and came up before, that I think is very important, is collaboration. We've done a very good job within financial services. There's a very good job of sharing of threat information and best practices, but it doesn't cut across industries. And I believe that we need to, if not share the specific information, clearly you're dealing with national security information that we shouldn't have, but the best practices and how to deal with threats by collaborating across industries. And I'll just finish up by mentioning there's an organization that's forming in New England that's taking advantage of the knowledge that already exists in our industry, in the defense industry, in healthcare, cutting across a number of different groups called the Advanced Cybersecurity Center. We have vendors, we have users in there, and it's already showing that we're by sharing information about threats, we're able to learn something across industry. Now, having said that, it has to be very carefully controlled in terms of access, but I'm very optimistic that by collaborating across industry, we're going to be able to learn from each other and all do a better job.
No, it was, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, go.
So in the CSO magazine that came out this last month, there was an article that reflected upon a group of companies and the Port of Tacoma. So it's Starbucks, Amazon, Port of Tacoma, and a few other companies up in Washington State that are building a collaborative network that are able to share that type of information, because it's very significant that the Port of Tacoma receives information that Amazon and Starbucks may not, and vice versa. And to be able to take that type of data and do something with it is really starting to become a reality, right? Something that we've been looking for a long time.
Kurt?
Yeah, I think security folks, they tend to get pretty protective about the information concerning breaches, and I think there's always a balance of being able to share that information with your industry peers and with your friends. I think you'll find that at the operational level, folks that are involved in the day-to-day work here, the relationships are critical with your partner companies and with your peers out there, and the ability to pick up the phone and call somebody is so important, because the adversaries that you may have out there that are targeting you, they're using that very same technique. They are very connected, very socially aware, and there are no borders or boundaries that confine them to one particular modality. They'll change tactics faster than you can change checklists. I guarantee that. So you've got to be able to talk and do so rapidly and openly. And sometimes those relationships aren't even formally defined, but they usually are the most helpful.
Yeah, we've just started on an initiative that we're calling Project Stonewall, and we're partnering with you and partnering with Homeland Security in this pilot to figure out how we can collaborate more quickly, more in real time, to exchange exactly that threat information. So if we know that this IP address is a bad IP address, then sort of like any virus updates, we can push it out to everybody and everyone can know about it at once, and then that raises the cost for the attacker, so that the attacker can't reuse the same destinations across different groups, and same thing with other URLs and so on. And I think there's a lot of promise there in this real-time collaboration method.
That's great.
And we on the, I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but we on the provider side are doing the same thing. We're able to share information among service providers, telecom groups, and by being able to take in the heuristic analysis of what traffic should look like or does look like or can look like, and being able to determine what's outside of the norm, we share that with all of our partners, our providers, our upstream providers, and we're able to build a collaboration that we're all able to respond to those types of threats.
So a commonality, which we just discussed, was defense in depth, information sharing. And our focus is on risk and incrementally reducing risk. And I wanted to hit that point again, where, because we started briefly talking about data sharing, event sharing, but what types of methods can we use that could transform the raw data that we generate into protecting our business processes, understanding what the threats are to assets or to shared assets within these supply chains that go around the world. So as these supply chains reach around the world, so does our risk. And I want to hit that a little bit more.
I think the traditional, the way that we traditionally treat threats, we look at these, we look at discrete threats, and when you start talking about reducing risk, I think you really have to start thinking about what's possible in a little bit different light. And that's hard. I hear a common phrase that goes around that we need to teach our security and our risk folks how to think like a bad guy. Well, good luck with that, because the bad guys don't think like us. I know some bad guys. Trust me, they don't think like we do. What you can do, though, is teach people to think outside their comfort zone and to start thinking about downstream third and fourth generation and fourth party attacks and how that might affect us. And that starts that process, I think, of being able to look at your supply chain, look at your partners a little bit differently and say, if I were going to target a particular business process or a particular product line, what would be the way I would get to it besides, banging myself against the front gate? Where could I come in from the side on that? And you probably do a better job. But teaching someone how to be a criminal is a little bit more difficult.
All right, I'm going to shift the question a little bit to some of the statistics that were brought up by the Verizon breach report. So it's known that organizations may not realize that there is an attack that has occurred. There might be data exfiltration or data manipulation that's ongoing within their systems. So a key aspect to business continuity is to be able to proactively respond and to ensure that there's policies and procedures in place that allow business operations to respond and work through these contested environments that may exist. So I wanted to see if there's any lessons learned, not lessons learned, but if there's ways through which organizations can better respond to these types of attacks when they may occur within value chains that they may be part of. So it's more of an active response.
Well, perhaps multi-sourcing, if you're talking about the attacks that affect your supply chain, clearly the single supplier problem is there. So multi-sourcing, and multi-sourcing also allows you to compare two products that you might have purchased and make sure that one is providing the same functionality as the other. So there's a benefit there if you were speaking of the supply chain part of this problem. For ourselves, working through an attack, the ability to compartmentalize your environment rapidly is important. We run a 7x24 operations center monitoring our entire global network 24 hours a day. And the reason that's important is sometimes our attackers are awake when we are not. And we can't simply wait until the morning to deal with an issue. Rapid containment is absolutely critical. We've done some of the math on that in the past, and if you can shut it down quickly, then the size of the impact can be very small, but if you wait even hours, it gets beyond your control, and now you're affecting other business processes that maybe did not need to be affected.
Okay.
Just comment on that, and like a lot of things, it's turning what may seem like a disadvantage into an advantage, but we have offices in 26 countries, literally around the globe, and by spreading both IT and business operations around, we're able to get a number of benefits, not the least of which is on a contingency basis, the next time zone or the next time zone after that can take up those operations. But I have to get a plug in here for it. To me, it all derives from architecture, and the fact that I ran our architecture function for 9 years has a great deal to do with that. A lot of times, security is viewed as an add-on or an afterthought. And if you do that, then you've lost before you even begin. Architecture and security as part of that architecture, if you build it in from the beginning, you've at least got a fighting chance to deal with it. As I said, I've been technology my whole career, and I'm very optimistic that some technologies that have been around for a long time, if they're appropriately applied to this space. We've had encryption, very secure encryption for a long time. We use it. A lot of times it's only used as a point solution. If it were more pervasive, virtualization, we talk about virtualization like it's something brand new. It's actually been around for a very long time. Virtualization has the benefit of being able to isolate logical components that help security. And then the last one, and there's been a lot of talk about how the cloud creates security issues. And that may be true if you go into the cloud, you go to an external provider, you don't know where they are or what they're doing. We're building a private internal cloud, and we're applying some of the best practices that we've applied for a long time to running a data center. There's really not a whole lot of difference there. So you have layers of defense. Is this a hard problem? Absolutely. But I'm very optimistic that we've got enough smart people working on it. If we collaborate and we all commit to it, we're going to have incidents, but we'll be able to minimize them.
And in addition to the underlying infrastructure needing to be there for the security and everything else, and consistent from country to country and office to office, it's very important that the procedures are also the same across the board. If you have inconsistent procedures for isolation, for escalation, for incident management, for threat mitigation, then you end up no better off than you were if you didn't do anything from the beginning. So it's very important to make sure that around the world everybody is having the exact same processes that are followed, audited. You have a third party looking at it, and it's consistent.
I'll piggyback on that too. I think that having processes and procedures in place ahead of time is great. And to extend that, you should also have in place the understanding of who's going to be calling the shots when stuff goes south on you. Who has the authority to shut things down? Because let's face it, incident response and crisis management can be harmful to the business. It usually is. The things that you're going to put in place are done in triage mode, they're done under pressure, they're done under stress. Having those conversations ahead of time to understand where these roles and responsibilities begin and end can save you a whole lot of problems when something really major does happen. You find out all of a sudden that there are people who work within a large enough organization. You'll find out people don't even know that you have information security people on staff. And so the information security guy or gal calls up a line of business and says, well, we need to do this or we need to do that. And they say, I don't even know who you are. You're not shutting my this down. Those are really important conversations to have up front. And the good news is there are enough attacks occurring on a day-to-day basis where you'll get that practice anyway.
That's good news.
That's a silver lining.
Always look for a silver lining.
I want to see if I can build off that, the comment and the use of the cloud possibly as a mechanism through which you can provide business continuity when you're faced with threats. So, in an ongoing attack, if policies and procedures are put in place, that you have maneuverability along with defense in depth, but you have some way of maneuvering your business processes onto some type of hot site, warm site within a cloud. Are these practices being used, and can you engage your value chains to be part of your private cloud? Is that a mechanism through which provides some reasonable amount of continuity in your business line?
So, if you were to break down all of cloud services into two categories, private and public, both have the same answer, right? You need to make sure that the policies that are in place are consistent regardless of where the node of the cloud is. If it's private, it gives you additional capabilities to be able to protect it yourself, to be able to put your hands on it if you really needed to, because there is some physical place that it exists. But those policies have to be consistent, and as we were talking just a minute ago, they can look exactly like the security policies, the same disaster recovery, the same continuity plans that you have in place for your physical infrastructure, just reapplying to the cloud. And the capabilities are there. I do understand that there's still some apprehension out there, but it's quickly dwindling.
like to link the cloud conversation to the supply chain conversation, because I think there is a good story to tell there. You know, for companies like ours in the defense industry and in finance, there's a hesitation to go to, you know, these generic cloud services, and all for good reason. But for the smaller companies that you were referring to, I think that there is a strong benefit to them even now. Like you said, with, you know, their uncle coming in to work on the system on weekends, they cannot really respond in today's world the way they need to. But if we can help the cloud providers build services tuned to our domains, such as, you know, the defense sector or finance and so on, then I think that we could provide a really good service to those smaller suppliers. And then using federation services, we can link ourselves into it. And it can almost serve as a test bed for us to strengthen that environment until it really is strong enough for the larger companies to participate more directly.
Follow on. I mean, one reason that we have not moved externally at this point, except for some well-defined services, is the lack of a consistent identity management across organizations. So you mentioned federation. I mean, we're able to do federation in both directions with some of our customers, but we do it on a case-by-case basis. If, at least at a national level, we had some way, and here I'm getting into the consumer space where we're not, but I'm a consumer, if there were some better way of a national identity system which tied into standardized authentication, I think a lot of these cases of individuals who get trapped and have identity theft would start to go away.
Howard Schmidt in the White House is pushing under the Obama administration
Right.
NSTIC, the National Strategy for Identities in Cyberspace.
Yeah, no,
I think it's huge.
Yeah, it is, but it's kind of moving a little more slowly than,
it's
than
out there still.
a number of us would like
Yeah.
like to see.
I wanted to shift back to information sharing just for a moment. So I came out of another panel and they talked about collective intelligence. And I think in our discussion so far, we talked about the difficulties in sharing information where we have to transform it somewhat. If you look at an advanced persistent threat less as a piece of malware, but more as something that has a human element to it, groups of people working over very long time periods to gather information from our social networks, in order to begin to plan out some whaling attacks, spear phishing attacks. So these threat agents, these complex agents, are using multiple attack vectors. How do we leverage a notion of collective intelligence, intelligence sharing, moving from sharing raw data, understanding not only risk, but the uncertainty and the provenance associated with the risk? To better make sense of our systems, our complex end-to-end systems. So I want to see if we can kind of start talking a little bit about security as a platform and collaboration and dive into a little bit more on the information sharing side.
So, you know, there's a few things that have to happen. I think everybody kind of remembers when we started doing event correlation a decade ago. We were receiving information from multiple different systems and it didn't look alike. And we went through a process where we normalized data, normalized all those security events and brought it all in. We have to go through that again, right? And now it's no longer just looking at a single security event, but it's collaborating all the threats that are coming in that might be 0 day, that might be you know, festering over a long period of time. And it's going to be that normalization and that common knowledge and that common understanding of what the threat is and how that applies to the specific assets. And my asset might be of a different value than your asset, and you know, mine is obviously more important to me than yours is to me. But we all have to work together to make sure that we all understand that this kind of threat that looks exactly like this and has this potentiality can have this type of an impact to this asset that I have. And I do believe that day is coming quickly.
We have an information sharing group out of the U.S. government. I won't get too much more specific than that, but we participate in it. And so there is a role now in the what we call the defense industrial base for a place for us to start sharing this threat information, active data. And then there are actually some private clubs that we belong to, and I know you have yours, and we do try to share that active threat information. But I do think that as an industry, we need to get a lot smarter about tracking what we call high-value targets. And we have a program inside our company where we do that, and we try to provide extra briefings to those programs. We try to track those assets more carefully, and it's based on intelligence we have about our attackers. What systems are they interested in, and what do we care about? There's, I think, in the whole GRC realm, maybe we're beginning to think about that, but I don't think it's been instantiated yet in the general cyber practices, this idea of tracking assets rigorously.
So you're talking about asset classification, really looking at where are your family jewels and the important programs and services that you offer. And I think that we need to do an inventory. Everybody needs to understand where your important data is, or where your important formulas, or whatever it is you're storing that's important, because that's what the bad guys are going to go after if you have somebody who's targeting you. So finding out what that is the first step, and then of course you have to determine what's the right amount of pain and spending is appropriate to be able to protect them. That's the risk management game in a nutshell. How do we do that with people who we don't control, with our suppliers, with our customers, with our partners? That gets a little bit trickier. I don't know that policy alone can do it. I think relationships, I think building trust, these sharing. I think there's a certain human element to sharing this kind of threat information. It's the admission that something bad has happened to you. Nobody gets firsthand experience with cyber threats who hasn't had it happen to them. I think sometimes we don't always like to admit that, but that's the way you get experience in these things. So when you do share, it creates a certain bond, especially when you know that the other party has been part of something that you've been part of. So you should look for those opportunities within your different industries and across industries, if possible, to participate in that sharing.
So within sharing information, collaboration, privacy plays a key aspect to that. And as we develop these working groups that enable security as a platform, which is more of a face-to-face, more maybe a verbal discussion, privacy and sharing information that may not give away PII is important. Are there any methods in place, any policies in place, as we set up these groups, as their CIO's presence in the audience, as we start to be proactive in getting ready for certain things that may happen to organizations? Are there things that we can put in place in our SLAs or different types of agreements that will allow us to better share information as we develop these strategic relationships?
We're trying to tackle that in the defense industry with, we have an organization called tscp.org, and Northrop Grumman is part of it, and the DoD, and the UK Ministry of Defense, and lots of other folks like that. And it's to deal with that exact problem. How do we exchange information securely, do it in a federated identity environment, because I really don't want to try to figure out who's employed by Northrop this week. That's beyond my ability to do so, and so we want them to assert identities over to us. Yes, they should get on the Zumwalt destroyer program data that you're hosting. And so we've got this group. We've been working on this now for quite a few years. We have, I think, the identity piece down, leveraging PKI. The sticky wickets for us now are around how to exchange attributes about individuals securely and do it in a trusted way. And the sticky wicket part is actually legal, right? So when I check somebody's papers and say, yes, you're a UK person or a US person, well, is the Department of Defense going to accept that? Is Northrop going to accept that? And what if something goes wrong and I export something illegally? What's my liability? So the legal side is really the tricky part. So we're all meeting in Chicago coming up next month with the ABA to have conversations about what could these legal frameworks look like to get us to the next level of sharing.
There's probably a technological aspect to that too, is right now we really don't have an effective way to even apply business rules to those situations and have our identity systems responsive to these scenarios that might come up, whether you're dealing with national identity or whether you're dealing with particular business rules or business partnerships that need to be treated differently as far as authentication and access to our assets. So I think that as some of the standards that are emerging from the world of identity and access management, XACML, and other technologies that are out there that are specifically geared to help us make better decisions about who can access what. I think some of those problems will get a little bit easier to solve, but right now we really don't have a vocabulary that's universal for us to be able to express our desire as a business to allow this but not allow that, beyond just the most simplistic permissions and rules that have always been in place within IT.
Probably a good point to mention regulation, coming from a highly regulated industry. A lot of the recent activities relative to privacy probably should have been there long ago, but they're being driven by regulations that are coming out. In the U.S. at the state level, and there's really no consistency, and then the European Union, and then you go to Asia Pacific. Our business is data, and so we've applied the same mechanisms and the technology to the protection of privacy data. So from a technology point of view, I believe we're okay. When you get into the regulations, and even more so being able to prove at an audit level that you're complying with the regulations, it is doable, but it is more complex, and it does add to the cost of doing business. I mean, for a long time we've had regulations where data related to one geographic entity couldn't leave that area. And a lot of the privacy regulations are very similar in concept to that, but at least at the national level, it would really be good to have a single set of privacy regulations. Those of us who are Massachusetts-based know that the Mass 201 happen to be some of the most stringent in the country.
All right, so we have some time for some question and answers. I also have a few questions besides that. So wanted to see if anybody wanted to line up behind one of the microphones. We have microphones on both sides of the room.
Ready? Okay, yep. David Reed, SAP Labs. I've actually been sort of associated with the security technology business for 35 years now, and the thing that's new, which fits into the role of cybersecurity that you haven't talked about very much, is the role of security across jurisdictions in the supply chain. The Stuxnet worm is just a small example of that, where the idea of appealing to the U.S. government to protect a company that doesn't belong to the U.S., like mine, doesn't really, solve a problem. And so we actually, our company may find itself the target inadvertently of government actors, state actors, random supporters of government, as the Russian hackers in Estonia decide, oh, that's a great target or whatever. And so I'm really curious how you think about that, both in the industries like finance, where that's been sort of worked out because finance is a transnational industry, but more important in the supply chain world of ordinary businesses, not defense, but those businesses that, for example, might be under attack by a European country just because it finds that business is the best way to get at a particular other country's economic interests without actually declaring war.
Mm-hmm. It's Yeah, I was going to say it approaches a Title 10, Title 50 issue, which is a computer network attack. But I guess we'll stay away from that.
Right. Yeah. We don't attack. We leave that up to the governments to do so. But to your point, it's a sticky wicket for us, as I mentioned with TSCP. The reason we started that group, the first word is actually transglobal. And the members of that organization are the Netherlands Ministry of Defense, the French Ministry, the UK, the US. And we started it for that multi-jurisdictional problem of exchanging defense information where the rules are different and there's a Wassenaar agreement for these exports and U.S. international traffic and arms regulations here. And so how do we squish all that together? And privacy rules in Canada versus privacy rules in California. And yeah, I don't think it's an easy answer. I don't see anything coming that's going to solve it quickly. And I suspect what we're going to see is maybe a dividing up of the internet a little bit into more sector-specific clouds. I think that that's one way of helping to contain the risk. Right now, everybody's connected, and somebody who's has a bad day in Indonesia can attack someone in China, and so on and so forth. And I don't think that that's going to be tolerated much longer. And so we're going to start seeing some greater segmentation. Yeah.
One area that I'm hopeful will have some impact is I talked about these cross-industry collaboration groups. And while it's starting with sharing threat information and best practices, one of the other longer-term goals is to be able to make some policy recommendations and then go to the executive, go to the legislature at the national level, representing a cross-industry set, which carries a lot more weight than a single company, and say, here are the things that we need to protect ourselves. We may be based in New England, but we do business around the world. Here are things that you can do from a legislative or regulatory point of view to help us.
Question on the right.
Yeah, so my name is Nicholas Carey from Capgemini Consulting. I had a question about, you were speaking about who the bad guys are, right? So you take a private company like, or I guess public company like Microsoft and PlayStation, and their approaches to the people who hack their device per se, right? Microsoft allows you to hack the Kinect to do innovative things, and it's a new source of revenue for them. PlayStation decides to sue Mr. Hotz, and now their network goes down for a month. When you do risk assessment, is that part of it? Is the business decisions that you make part of that risk assessment? And if so, can you talk about it a little?
I think it had better be. If you're in that business, because Microsoft's initial strategy wasn't to be open about the Kinect until it became apparent that they ought to be. But you have to, yeah, absolutely. You got to look at your product lines beyond just the, how many of these are we selling and to whom. But what is the community that uses them doing with them, and what is their stake, and what potential outcomes could be part of a dispute or something that is community-based. You can find a backlash that turns into a hacking attack that goes from a message board conversation to an organized attack on your company or your product or your reputation in minutes. And you have to know how to deal with that. Yes, you definitely should be thinking about that from a risk perspective.
Question on the left.
One of the things, excuse me, one of the things that you all have talked about in terms of privacy is data loss. And this morning we heard kind of a story of what happens if somebody breaks into a data center and just steals a bunch of hard drive platters. And from a technology nuts and bolts perspective, can you comment on the feasibility of just storing data in encrypted form on disk? And I kind of think to my head, in the same way that I establish a connection with my bank, and it's encrypted, and there's a key and all that kind of good stuff, why can't data be stored on a disk in encrypted format all the time, so that if a tape falls off a truck or somebody steals the Harvard University database of applicants, like happened a couple of years ago, or some bank loses a tape or a laptop, that the thief will just get bits and bytes And is that not feasible? And if not,
Yeah,
why
so
isn't
we
that?
actually have that today. There are drives that are produced called self-encrypting drives, SEDs, right? And they have hardware in them to do it. You can also buy products like PGP that will do what they call whole disk encryption, and BitLocker from Microsoft will do whole disk encryption. The weakness in that framework is that you have to manage those keys for the life, and if you need to do business, recovery, right? Hey, something went wrong and I need to do this, and you can't find the key or something has gone wrong, then you've created a weakness in your environment. So there's a problem there. There's also a performance hit to doing encryption, and sometimes that's a bit of a problem. If you're doing high performance computing, that additional overhead is too much of a problem for you. And then the last reason that encryption isn't quite everything that you'd want it to be is that the system that is running needs to have that decryption key in memory in order to operate, right? It needs the data. And so the system is actually retrieving the data live, and a hacker can get into the system and simply pull the data out and say, oh, thank you for decrypting that for me. So it's great for the physical theft side, but causes all kinds of other chains of problems.
And taking that same issue and moving it into the cloud world, we have historically seen the same problem, right? You may have a VM that is typically stored unencrypted, unless it's on an encrypted drive, and then when it has to boot, maybe it's got to reboot for some reason, it's got to go through that key restoration process, or that, grab the key so that it can start again, which causes operational issues. But there are more and more technologies that are starting to fix that, where it allows you, the consumer of the cloud product, to manage your own keys and be able to proactively provide that key in a secure key exchange manner that will boot the VM back up and get you back up and running. But that's still a very new technology.
And I'll say about encryption, today's encryption technologies, they break IT. They don't make IT easy to use. They make search a useless technology to us in most cases. It's very difficult to do a full text search of something that's a garbled mess of encrypted text. They're also particularly vulnerable because we've sort of put the onus of the entire system security with encryption in the hands of the average user. Protect your key, choose good passwords. It doesn't work. You can have the strongest encryption.
On a Post-it note.
Right, exactly. You can have the strongest encryption algorithm out there. It's FIPS certified, or whatever standard you want to apply to it. Improperly managed, and the number of keys that is just exponentially exploding out there, especially at the data center level, where you might have multiple keys per file, and multi-thousands and hundreds and millions of files that are being stored in these systems. And then you can imagine the key management problem on top of that becomes its own classification of problems. So I think that encryption, when it comes down to the individual asset, the individual information asset, it's an appropriate technology for that last line of defense, where this absolutely has to never be seen by somebody who can't, and you have a very controlled environment with which to execute it. But on the large scale, we're just not ready for encryption at that scale, I don't think.
Thanks.
I want to take a slightly, I have to take a slightly different view. I'm a big fan of encryption, and while I agree with all of the issues, that's taking, to me, a much too narrow view of encryption. And looking at a solution that provided pervasive end-to-end encryption, there are solutions to the key management problem, so the user doesn't have to deal with the key. There are solutions. Each one of these has a solution to it. I mean, you have the archive issue if you're storing your archives, and so there are format preserving encryption capabilities. We need to be investing more in that at the architectural level, not just view it as the physical device. And I'm not saying, and we do it for physical devices, but that's only dealing with one part of the problem. If we took a more end-to-end view of using encryption, I believe we could improve that. I think I was at the session this morning. The issue was not just that it was unencrypted, but they also didn't know what was on it.
Correct,
So
right.
I think there was a larger problem than just a security
It was a
problem
public
there.
cloud, and somebody
Yes.
Let me, from the other perspective though, let me also add in there that your adversaries are using encryption too. The same encryption. So it has advantages to both sides. And that becomes particularly difficult when you're trying to deal with an issue, is encryption can be used against you as well.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, and just there's inherent cost. Every time we look to incrementally reduce risk, there's inherent cost, and a lot of times risk reduction is often neglected because of those issues. So, question on the right.
Yes, hello. Pascal Aguirre, Cognizant Technology Solutions. It strikes me that the overwhelming proportion of the attention and investment on this issue goes to defense, which to me feels a little bit like fighting a war with just a Coast Guard and a Border Patrol.
No offense though, right?
Yeah,
No
what,
offense,
what
but
if
don't.
anything can be practically done to start playing offense a little bit more on this space?
Yeah, so yet another Title 10, Title 50 question, and I think we
I
talked
wouldn't
about
be allowed to
information sharing.
comment on that.
Yeah.
I would end up at Leavenworth if I opened my mouth. Just gonna be quiet.
But I think the one way we can indirectly talk about that is information sharing. I think there's certain authorities that allow certain activities to happen, and if you develop those relationships maybe sooner than later before the attack occurs, those close strategic relationships, it might help and benefit the situation. I don't know if we can comment to that.
Yeah,
If I turn the question slightly, and I'm not going to touch the offense part, to me it starts with prevention. Now you need to be able to deal with incidents, but the whole goal here is to prevent them from happening, and it's a whole range of things. If you can detect an anomaly early on before it turns into a threat, that's really what you want to be doing. So if that's your definition of offense, I'm in agreement with it.
There is one safe thing I suppose I could talk to you about on the offense side, but there is a concept of watermarking that it could be helpful. And so if you take your good data and you watermark it in a way, it can help you see if your intellectual property is showing up elsewhere. And so there's a bit of an offensive tilt maybe to that idea of saying, hey, wait a minute, this showed up out somewhere else.
Watermarking.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I love my encryption. It's good stuff, but you got to be use it carefully. It's like pepper, Yeah.
Best defense is an offense, right? So, question on the left.
Actually, a similar vein as the gentleman from Cognizant, Rob Palatnik from Depository Trust and Clearing Corp, by the way. And this from an architectural and strategic view. I'd like to take it as opposed to offense. And the question is really, is this as good as it gets? And are we basically stuck for the next N number of years buying multiple layers of security products, dealing with multiple layers of security platforms and internal platforms, which to me is similar to putting money under your mattress and putting some locks on the door? And can't we define the cloud in terms of a new security paradigm where we've basically virtualized the infrastructure, we've gotten the money out from the mattress, put it in the banks in some virtual bits, and take a whole different approach and redefine the cloud to make it the killer app, as opposed to kind of where it is, I don't know if it's secure enough. It's the opposite of where we should be going.
See, I agree that what we should be doing is leveraging benefits of scale, right? If we do go through and we are, and the answer is yes, we should always be implementing defense in depth. That's never going to go away. Your firewall is never going to protect you from your authentication issues. But as you're applying your defense in depth, you can leverage the benefits of scale in the environment that you put in a cloud with a cloud provider, with the cloud solution of another consumer of the cloud environment. And by leveraging that common platform of security, your defenses become smaller in cost, but higher in effectiveness.
I think to answer the first part of your question, I'd say that I disagree because I think it's probably going to get worse, not better. I think that we're going to be fighting a defensive battle for a long time. But I do agree that the cloud largely has been viewed with a sort of a jaundiced eye and a lot of suspicion. And I think that, you know, at some point we have to recognize the potential of that technology to, even if you look at the most basic thing that security organizations could do, is to make their own operations more efficient and not consume as many resources as they do, which is becoming a lot more of IT budgets. To become operationally efficient frees up the minds and the hands to be able to do things that make more of a difference, actually doing threat intelligence and analysis versus maintaining all of the gear and infrastructure now associated. In a large company, you're carrying a huge amount of security stuff that is out there, from agents on desktops to encryption this and key servers and management and identity, and it just goes on and on and on. As we could virtualize, outsource, and otherwise, in a trustworthy way, use the cloud to relieve some of that burden. I think we can get better work done that way.
I think there are a couple of hopeful things, though, coming down the pike. One, Intel's acquisition of McAfee, I think, is going to lead potentially to embedded security into chips that are designed, you know, to handle virtualization with security features embedded in it. I know some of the work that they're doing is going to be targeted at like the smart grid and SCADA systems and that sort of thing. So hopefully that will bear some fruit. One of Raytheon's companies is BBN right here in Cambridge, and we're working on some projects with people on Internet 2, right, the next generation Internet, which will be sort of built from the ground up. And you know, the design there is to have security embedded, you know, at the ground layer, not like we did, you know, with this version of the internet where it was like, you know, gluing it on here and Band-Aids and other kinds of messy things. Yeah.
Just add to that comment. I think it's good news and bad news. The good news is I completely agree with you that a cloud-based model with virtualization as a future state should be what we're building toward. But we all have a lot of legacy systems that are not going to go away for a long time. So we're going to be living in some kind of a hybrid world. We're going to need to have all of the mechanisms we have today, probably some new ones, because there are people thinking of new ways to attack us. But absolutely, we should set as a goal to move to a model that's architected from the ground up with security, and a lot of the issues that we have today that deal with a physical attack, they're just not going to be capable of being done because the attacker won't know where it is because it's been virtualized.
Yeah, and that proposal went into putting ownership of risk onto, I believe, outside U.S. Entities, and putting policies in place that would provide that. And we talked in general terms about sharing information outside, but I think the question of enforcement might come up in this, and I don't know if we have any discussion around enforcement of such a policy and how we could work together with the government in this context. But again, I don't know who would carry that out. I don't know if it would be DHS or some other entity that would carry out the policy.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that we're going to see security capability embedded in the internet service providers, helping screen out the bad stuff. There's absolutely no reason that my grandmother needs to fight, you know, a cyber war at her desktop. It's absurd, right? You know, when you think about that, you know, somebody can be attacking her from a foreign country, and really there's no phone number for her to call. It's, you know, it's kind of crazy. We wouldn't tolerate it if somebody were throwing missiles over our borders, right? And so I'm hoping that we do that screening in the you know, internet service providers. There's some movement in that direction. I understand the risks to that, of course. You know, I'm a fairly libertarian person myself, and don't really encourage government involvement in my day-to-day life. But in this case, you know, we need a little bit more protection than we're seeing right now.
I think what we're missing right now is visibility into the systems outside of the U.S. We have a little bit in the EU, but you know, we've done a significant amount of work with the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI, and it gets to a point as you're working through identifying these threats that they no longer share information with you. they stop telling you, what the source is, what the traffic looks like, and give you any idea of what you can do to protect yourself. So what I'm hoping to see is a little bit more of an open kimono when you're dealing with the government in working through international threats.
All right, so I want to thank the panelists today. If everybody would like to join us. And also MIT Sloan for putting this panel together. Thank you very much.